You know, you'd mentioned the clinical role,
Yeah.
and we read so much these days of work with drugs, the biochemistry of the brain, Prozac, and a whole range of chemicals that are used to change or change personality in some ways. In your experience, what is the relationship between a biochemical treatment of depression, say, and a psychoanalytical approach?
Well, you see, luckily human beings are neither mind nor body. They are both. So if that one, I think everyone notices, if you are depressed, the biologist will say, aha, this chemical in the brain, which they'll test and find out its level has gone down. Very true. But your body will, your shoulders will start sagging, your voice will go down. So there are both together, what one calls a dialogical between body and the mind. So you can start the treatment either on the bodily changes, you start that will improve the other, or on the other way, which will also improve the biological part. So since we are so intimately connected, the body and mind, that you can start the treatment anywhere, which will kind of improve the whole person. Now, the biological drugs in some kind of things are much more effective, while they go much more strongly. The mind part or the therapy part, there are resistances because people do not want to change. In fact, who wants to change except a wet baby? So otherwise, so there is great resistance to change, and that takes a much longer time. And of course, the investment, both emotional, financial, is much more. So in some cases, some kind of cases, the biological
So why not
treatment,
just pop pills?
the pop pills will not take care of where your story has gone wrong. It will kind of take you away from your story. It will take you away from the causes of it. It will remove all the symptoms. And many say that is all what is needed. That is all what it is all about. But this is kind of a philosophical difference between the two kind of approaches, is that you do not treat just the symptoms, but you would like to see what led to the symptoms.
In the Eastern traditions and in the Indian tradition, we have the most sophisticated and complex mind training techniques. What role does that play in changing attitudes and coping with problems?
I think they're very, very effective ones, the Indian or the Eastern, let's say, the mind training ones. They, of course, also go through, treat the whole person through the mind, because that's your bodily part. In fact, we combine it often very well. I mean, many of the yoga schools, etc., is a very good combination of both body and mind part of it. The difference between the Indian or the Eastern and the psychotherapeutic ones is the idea or the focus is what is mind, what is the self there. In the Western parts is the biographical self, which is important. Your biography is what you are. Here, in the Eastern ones, it is not the biography. The biography is completely ignored. There is a notion of a mind removed from biography, which is the focus. So the focus of what the mind is too different. Many Western psychotherapists would say that does not exist, which I do not agree with. And the Eastern would say the biographical one is important, but not that important. So there would be kind of conflicts on that, or at least disagreements on that. But both are really much more the mind.
You did a book called The Analyst and the Mystic, in which you looked at Ramakrishna from a perspective of a psychoanalyst. What were some of your conclusions in that kind of exploration?
Well, that kind of exploration, you see, being an Indian psychoanalyst means you are kind of writing at two levels. I was once at one level discussing with my Western psychoanalytic colleagues who have looked upon mystics and people, especially kind of florid mystics like Ramakrishna, whose ecstasies, etc., were kind of, to them, scandalous, as they would say, it is completely psychotic. So I was arguing upon one level with them that this is not psychotic, that we can make very good sense out of them.
How do you make sense of, Sri Ramakrishna went through a series of experiences, peak experiences of sadhanas, where he would, he would tie a tail around on his back and then prance around as if he was Hanuman, or he felt he experienced the body of Christ and Muhammad. To appearances, there's a very fine line between religious ecstasy and what we would perceive as being madness.
Yeah, well, you're right about the fine line, and because to appearances both can look very much the same. The differences, I think, are twofold. That in madness, not two, I think there are two or three things where you can see the differences. In madness, that part, what you call the ecstasy, or they would call the psychopathology part, is not a willed one. It takes you over, and you can't get out of it. It is out of your control. In the mystic's ecstasy, it is much more controllable. Second, the ties with other people, affectionate ties, and that is one of the very big criteria for health, mental health, in Western psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, is to love and work both well. Mystics' capacity for love and work are very much heightened, and one sees it, the amount of love which is kind of radiated by them and the disciples, etc., whereas both those capacities are completely impaired in the psychotic. So these are two very big differences. What happens is, what you look at the mystic is really that there is, you see, all kind of normal people, we have boundaries between waking and sleeping, night and day, adult, child, all kind of boundaries, inner, outer. Now in creative people, those boundaries are much more permeable. That in artists and various kind of other creative people. And I think those thin boundaries of the mind is what a mystic has, which a psychotic does not have. So what Ramakrishna does, at that moment he is becoming Hanuman or whatever else, because he can cross those boundaries, but he can cross them back also. It's not that he stays in those, and that is one of the kind, I think, very, very big difference. The best metaphor, of course, I think, which I use there is that the current, psychic current, which throws through your mind in full force in both these madness and in mystic ecstasy. In one case, it short circuits the brain, which is madness, and the other it illuminates, and which is the mystic.
Would you say that in the case of Ramakrishna, certainly, that it involved an enormous capacity to experience both pleasure and pain, the pain of yearning and the ecstasy of experience?
Yes.
Is there a parallel with that for the psychotic, or the psychotic just experiences the pain and not the ecstasy? Or?
One can't say that, you see, because you have to be really in the psychotic's mind to see that. But yes, but generally the painful one, are much, much greater ones. And also, as I said, it is not to experience, to be able to experience the world and yourself. I think that is really the goal of psychoanalysis, as well as any kind of mystical part also, that you have to become so open that you start seeing the world afresh. Things you hear have a different music. The things you see are looked at differently. So the capacity to experience is very, very important, and Ramakrishna's capacity to experience, so to say, was, I think, one of the highest in that sense, and what a mystic also aims for, and what I think creative artists also aim for a way, and which I think all psychoanalysis also really aims for in helping the clients. It's not only coping with problems, but how to experience in a much more lively way with your whole mind, body and soul, rather than just going through life dimly.
Do you find that the practice of psychoanalysis sometimes, what does it do to you personally? You're familiar with the vocabulary, the techniques, the technology, as it were, of working with the mind. How do you relate to that yourself in your own life? Do you find that you're psychoanalyzing yourself all the time?
No, because that would be awful. That would be awful, because, of course, what happens is that, you see, it is like anyone else. A mystic is a mystic only when he's being a mystic, not otherwise. We always attribute that to all your 24 hours. A poet is a poet when he's writing poetry, or he's being a poet, not all the rest of the time.
I thought there's a special sensibility that comes to being a mystic or to being a poet, and the boundaries are very fine, and so that's the kind of person you are.
That kind of sensibility spreads, but you are not really exercising that sensibility all the time, not when you are eating or with your children. So that sensibility may be there, but it is not at its highest. That is only being exercised at that particular time when you are being an analyst.
But does that make you perhaps more vulnerable, or calls for greater discipline, that you don't apply your techniques and insights too much on yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, because one of being an analyst is of being healthy in that sense is also of not reflecting too much on yourself and no kind of self-obsession. Life should be mostly lived on its own part. It should live by itself mostly. I mean, if you are too much self-scrutiny and all is not a great thing. And that is the danger of the antiquar profession. That is also something which you need. I mean, sometimes when you get your blind spots, etc., then you have to apply those techniques.
What happens when an analyst needs analysis? He goes to another analyst?
He goes to another analyst. In fact, in the early years of analysis, it was almost de rigueur that analyst after every 5-10 years went kind of a refresher to another one, because you do develop kind of blind spots, which are unavoidable because you also have as much an unconscious as anyone else. There are some things which are painful for you, which you will not want to see if they're coming out in the client. And when it keeps on being repeated and you kept on being hit on the head by the patient, why don't you see this? Then you start thinking, why don't I see it? What is my problem? So you have to do that kind of self-analysis all the time.
You'd mentioned the mistake, and we talked about creativity. In some measure, these are all facets that we all aspire to, that we have these qualities. To what degree do you feel these, well, let me ask you this question in the context of Ramakrishna again, because you've studied this, that how much of this is genetic, how much of it is comes from the environment, how much of it is karmic for you, not just purely from your academic learning, but as an Indian living in India and working here largely. These are so much a part of our ingrained experience and our assumptions.
That's right. I don't have an answer. I think there's the mixture, the combination of what is the genetic part. What you are asking about is, you're quite right, that I think we are all born with the great capacity for creative experiencing. And that, of course, one sees in the little babies, and when they look at the world with a kind of delight and the pleasure and what the world is, a discovery, to recreate or to rediscover that kind of pleasure in adulthood about the world, to recreate the world, comes to very few people. The mystics, I would say, yes, and some coming up with artists.
You've also done a study on childhood in India.
Yeah.
And are there sort of areas where the childhood experience in India is distinctive and hence makes us as Indian adults perhaps different to other communities and societies? And in what ways?
Well, I think, you see, what happens, I think, is that every society or every culture has a limited number of concepts which tell the child of what is the world like, what are good and evil and good prototypes, and what is actually a good life, unconscious kind of a life plan. And these concepts the culture gives to a child, or a society gives to a child, mostly through stories. There can be legends, myths, stories told by others, fables. So all that comes to the child that this is what the world is like. So every culture in that sense is distinctive.
What are some of the sort of dominant, typical stories that are distinctive for our culture?
Well, I think one thing distinctive for our culture is, all right, the worldview that of course, that the world is there is a quest. And if you are very good, whatever way you are, etc., you are going to get something more and higher way of experiencing, and that whether it is moksha, etc., that it's a quest, you go higher and higher with the kind of obstacles come on the way, but if you deal with them, etc. So it's there is a romantic vision of the quest of life.
The higher is not merely a material one,
no,
but it is something.
It is much more higher. And some other cultures wouldn't have this romantic quest, and they would have very kind of ironic one. There is nothing at all after that. All that you have is here, take that, take the cash, let the credit go, kind of a thing, which one. So there are these different kinds of, so we have, I think, a romantic quest in the Indian culture, which we get as a child, that is certainly there. Then, of course, we get a view of our body, that the bodies are not, and that comes from our medicine, Ayurvedic part of it, that there's a very intimate interconnection of our bodies with the whole world around. There are exchanges taking place, that it is not a kind of a fortress in itself, So things are not only happening inside the body, whereas some other culture where then biology would be much more important, and we'll have a much more metaphysical kind of biology of influences from outside on the body, which includes then the stars, stones, everything is influencing everything else. So this kind of a fluid way of looking at the world, so that is also would be part of our culture.
Yet it seems that as India develops and India is educated, these stories are being lost.
Yeah, and in fact, with that, I think some of our distinctiveness of that would be lost. I think it would be kept, and it may kind of flower again. But yes, with the loss of these stories, we would be losing very distinct way of looking at the world, distinct way of saying what is evil and what is good, and what is and what is a life plan all about, what are our distinctive life plans.
But what implications does this change have for, well, I mean, it's an American ideal, the pursuit of happiness. I'm not even sure that it's our ideal, but it seems to be well, is that an ideal for a psychoanalyst to encourage his patient to pursue happiness?
No, because you see, happiness one cannot, there is no kind of abstract or objective ways of looking at happiness. Everyone has such a different idea of happiness inside when you really come inside that you cannot say the pursuit of freedom. I think if one was, that would be the psychoanalytic idea, the pursuit of inner freedom.
So just to go back to this change that we now see, because these stories are sort of receding deeper into our unconsciousness. What implications has that had in the areas that you have looked at? Relationships is something that interests you. And we'll talk about violence. I think that's something else that you've done a lot of work on. What tangible impacts has that had on relationships, for example?
Well, relationships, okay, let me put it this way. There is a very nice, I think it is Schopenhauer's originally, and Schopenhauer was very much influenced by Indian philosophy. He compared relationships to porcupines on a cold night, that they come near to seek warmth, but then they prick each other, so it pains, so they move away, and that this keeps on repeating whole night till an optimum is found where the pain of nearness and the coldness of distance are somehow balanced. Now, our culture was on the side of we'll rather have the pain of nearness in family rather than the coldness of distance. That, I think, is shifting. We are getting people now, I mean, in cities, etc., who are much more prepared to have the coldness of distance rather than the pain of nearness. So that kind of tolerance in relationships, families, etc., is going down.
But isn't this, would you say that this is a prevailing a point of view, the pain of nearness? I mean, at one level, you seem to suggest that we need human beings. There is sort of the natural craving for merging with either God or another human being. I don't quite understand the pain of nearness.
Well, the pain of nearness always is that you have to give up some of your wishes, needs, desires, etc., with the other human being who is also expressing his or her wishes, needs, or desires. If I only want to keep on stressing on my needs, desires, then there's going to be a conflict between the two, and that is the pain. But if I'm not really that much interested in the other person, if I kind of put a psychological distance between the two, then I may not have to go through that. Then I can go through with my, this is me, this is what I want, and that's it. So this is the pain of nearness, is really pain of having your wishes, desires not being realized, not gratified.
You've also done a book on intimate relations. What does your sort of, this view do to notions of love?
Which love? You mean?
Well, I think sort of both between erotic love, spiritual love for God, and love in the sense of compassion, of concern for others, where you're willing to experience the pain of nearness. Well, let's look at the pain of nearness as an act of love.
Yes, I think it's only in kind of the highest ecstasy, or not ecstasy, the throes of love where you can experience the pain of nearness, where you experience it very gladly. And I think that is common. I don't think there's much difference between spiritual love and so-called erotic love. I think they're all the same. That when you are really in the throes of that, that pain is very much almost welcome because it is not your own. What is love? Well, love to me would be well, I think love is really the search for transcendence of getting out of your body, because being born in the world is being born into your body, locked into your mind, and love is I think the only we have for creative people and mystics and all, leaving them aside, but for the rest of us, and that's why it's great power, is that being in love is the time, and especially in sexual love, in erotic love, when for moments you are out of your body, you are out of your own mind, merged with the other one. And that is its great attraction, its great power. In fact, when people say that psychoanalysis of Freudian, it is a psychology of love. It is not psychology of sex, as everyone says. In fact, I think sex is because it makes you transcend yourself much more. I mean, it is the very strong feeling, bodily feeling of that transcendence. Transcendence is the primary part. Sexuality helps in doing that. So I would see it as a reverse relation.